Let's be white women talking about white women.
Hello, Jessica Letaw.
Hello, Patricia Berry.
Would you like to bring us into this space? We are getting towards the end of this particular journey.
Mm-hmm. We are. We are at the next to last session and last chapter of the book White Women Everything You Already Know About Your Own Racism and How to Do Better. Patricia and I conceived of this series, and when I say Patricia and I mean Patricia, a couple of months ago, as a way of having a conversation with each other built on honesty and accountability, and extending that conversation out into our respective communities, hoping to continue to build the muscle of white solidarity, white community, white sisterhood, to be able to move into our own kind of individual and communal racialized learning in meaningful ways.
Mm-hmm.
So we're back. We're talking this week about chapter 9, the last chapter: white allies, white saviors, and white violence. So maybe we can introduce ourselves and go into the working agreements.
Mm-hmm.
I'll start this time. I'm
Mm-hmm.
Jessica Letaw. Most people call me Jess. I am a community organizer for housing justice, and I think a lot about what it means to belong in a place, and to belong to people. And pretty much all the work that I do professionally and personally is kind of geared around that belonging. My own racialized learning journey started around 10 years ago, when before that, I had sort of assumed that poverty and various other identities kind of checked my oppression card, and I didn't need to do any particular learning about race, because for me, I was fairly blind to whiteness as a racialized construct. And I fell rather bumpily into the knowledge that I was wrong about that, and have been on a learning journey ever since, coming very gratefully into community with you, Patricia. Not because of that, but you and I have done a fair amount of this learning and talking together, not limited to, but including these sessions.
Mm-hmm. And I'm Patricia Berry. I work as a fundraising consultant, specifically coach and consultant, working with people who are looking for anti-racist approaches to white-centered philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a particularly community-centric approach. And if I think about overall what I am interested in, what my work is, it is how do communities come together in healthy ways? And one of the quickest ways to screw that up or solidify that is the exchange of wealth. And that has been my work for about 25 years. I think over the last 10 years, I have more and more recognized how blind I was to the racialized nature of what I was doing in nonprofit, and begun some very intentional work on myself, and uprooting some of my um, own racism and assumptions around the sharing of wealth. So that's how I came into this particular work, and with Jess as a friend, have had some wonderfully raw and difficult conversations that are both held in love and accountability, and I see as a very centralized part of my work. So one of the reasons I love this conversation is you can have this too in your community of white women. There is a way that we can help each other towards a more beloved community, and approach. Um, so as we learn, we're also hoping that you take a couple tips and move forward with your own conversations.
One of the tools that we use to allow ourselves to sink really deeply into these conversations and not revert to fragility or shutting down, or any means of interrupting or stopping the work, is by using what we call working agreements. And these are, as it sounds like, agreements that Patricia and I discussed prior to starting the series, that we felt would act as both an invitation and maybe bumpers for how to keep us on track in our learning. So I'll bring those up right now, and I'll kick us off. The first one is that we put aside the right to comfort. Uh, we really don't have a right to comfort in this learning because the world isn't a safe place. So this isn't a safe space. This is a brave space. And so Patricia and I have invited ourselves, and we invite you to loving accountability. You and I have known each other and loved each other for a long time. And here we love each other enough to tell the truth and to hold up mirrors that need holding up. So we plan on kindness and honesty because they're not mutually exclusive. And I'll also say for the folks that are following along on the onlines, here live with us and later on watching these recorded, we invite you to these working agreements as well as you're considering your own learning and in the comments if you decide to contribute and participate in the conversation.
Another one of our values for these conversations is that we are allowed to ask for the speed we need. While we aren't defaulting to comfort, we are defaulting towards learning. And learning happens in different ways for different people. And truthfully, for me, different ways at different times and different days and different subjects. So asking for pausing, asking for reflection time, the speed that I need to be a learner and a thoughtful learner in this space is part of our agreements with each other. Mm-hmm. Another value that we have is to resist binary thinking. We invite each other to resist black and white thinking, except as we're specifically talking about race. Don't go towards right or wrong, either or. We want to resist those concepts because what we're doing is really a gradient and depends always on the context of whatever it is that you're experiencing.
And the last one is that we welcome conflict, acknowledging that in dominant culture and where we are in the Midwest and as women, kind of pick your identity, we are often rewarded for being nice instead of being real and for being conciliatory instead of leaning into disagreement. So here in these conversations, we invite ourselves and each other to allow for a lot of emotional space, to be in conflict with ourselves, with each other, and even with the ideas being presented. We do not have to agree all the time. And in fact, the juice of the juice is often found in figuring out where those frictions are. So those are our working agreements. And with that, I will bring us in to the next part of our conversation, which is the White Lady Check-in. Patricia, I wonder how whiteness has shown up for you this week.
It's interesting because as I was kind of looking at our agenda, every time the White Lady check-in comes in, I have a really hard time pulling something up. And I think reflecting on that indicates how often I am in the water of whiteness and not always yet noticing where it comes and goes for me. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that I struggle with it. I struggle with the White Lady check-in, but I am also very happy for the discipline because it is causing me to notice things more. Specifically, I think where I would talk about where I experienced my whiteness in a particular way this week is I have I was invited to join a cohort of learners with the businesses of color. We're doing a mind your business kind of a mastermind group. I am the only white person in a group of, I think there's 14 of us. And I really recognized this weekend when we had our first in-person meeting, how rare that is for me to be the minority in a room and how much grace was given to me by everybody in that room to feel welcome. I had really struggled whether to apply for this mastermind group because I just wasn't sure if it was for me. And the person who runs it had invited me to apply because it was open to everybody and felt that the work that I was doing was applicable to the other people that were in the group as well. In fundraising, my work in fundraising was applicable to them. So I just want to recognize the name that was an uncomfortable place. And I also recognized really deeply that I was in the right place. Like this was the exact right place for me. And to recognize the grace that was given to me in particular, that I am not sure I have always given to a person who doesn't identify as white in an all white group where they are the minority. So I'm just naming that. I think that's how the whiteness has showed up for me this week.
So you mentioned the grace that was offered you, but I would like to ask for your first person feeling. Like, how does it feel to be in that room?
I feel careful.
Okay.
I feel very much like I don't want to make mistakes. I don't want to make it an unsafe place. I don't want to create shame for myself. Like these are all very visceral kind of feelings that are going through my head.
Sure.
It is not a place for me of absolute comfort, which I recognize as a positive thing for me. I mean, I still worry so deeply about making mistakes, like really tragic mistakes. What will happen? And I'm sure when I make my first one, it will be a great learning experience, and I will move forward, and I will use all of the tools that we have talked here about, take responsibility and move on. But yeah, it's really rare that I am the single white person in a room. Did that answer your question?
It did.
Fully enough? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And I appreciate that. It's, again, I'm going to recognize that for me, part of the work is distancing myself from talking about what I am experiencing. And that is a white supremacy tool, as I have learned, that I am still not out of, you know, I am still working to work my way out of that.
Well, you have a lot of practice with the other way, you know. I appreciate you sharing. I really do. Hearing you talk about your feelings helps me understand mine. You know, when I find myself either in similar situations or different ones, but I'm trying to figure out, like, what is the name for the feeling that I have? Oh, I'm being careful. Oh, I'm not comfortable. You know, so that practice of asking you and others, like, how do you feel? It's not always a comfortable question, kind of regardless of the context, but it's one of my most relentless ones.
Well, I will reflect that when you asked me that and then I said careful, I did feel like I was oversharing something here on the interwebs, right? About there was something vulnerable about that. And that's the other aspiration I have, is like, let's just be vulnerable. Let's just name what it is that's happening. So I appreciate the question. There's a reason that I avoided it the first time.
All right.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you. Please continue.
No. I'm glad you did. I'm just sitting with what you said for a moment. I'm also sitting with, like, memories of rooms where I have been uncomfortable and the various reasons for that. So I understand feeling the overshare, and I want to be tender towards that. It was very useful for me. So from me, thank you. For me, one way that whiteness showed up for me this week, I'm in the process of reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, and it became apparent almost as soon as I picked up the book why folks have been so excited about this book. I have never, ever, ever read such a marriage of science and poetry. And it is also a deep learning of what it means to be human. The most recent chapter, she was describing teaching an ecology class to young adults. And she talked about the role that this class plays in shifting their relationship to the land. And I had to I'm doing it as an audiobook. I had to pause the book for a moment because I consider myself someone who works within, sustainability circles. It is a primary goal of mine, creating a healthier relationship to our climate. And, it's very quick changes. Many of my colleagues do similar work. Many of my friends do similar work. And when we talk about it, we talk about the climate and we talk about the planet. We even talk about our relationship to the environment, but I don't know that I or folks that I know have ever talked about our relationship to the land. I appreciated the word shift. It still feels really significant for me in ways that I'm still kind of understanding. I think my first pass at describing what it means to me is that a relationship to the land is, first of all, very first person and very intimate. It's not asking you to figure out how to solve things out there. It is figuring out how to get you to be in right relationship with the earth that your feet are on, and the feet of the people that you love are on. And it's not to abandon that widened relationship, but this whole book has talked about what it means to come into real, honest community. And instead of working on things out there, and that whole phrase, the land, just felt like it epitomized that so well. I don't know if I'm explaining it as clearly as I feel it, but that phrase really kind of landed on me as something as that is a racialized construct, but not a white one. And I appreciate it.
That reminds me of this. There's this concept that I've been noticing when I get a nose bump in my community about people who have a really strong sense of what the community owes to them, right? My land, my yard, my view, my real estate, versus people that are a little bit more like, what is my responsibility to the community? And then you add the additional note that you make on about what is my responsibility to the land that I'm standing on, that we are standing on. Changing that perspective, I recognize that feeling of shift. What should I get is different than what should I give.
Well, to your point about rights versus responsibilities, she talks about that several times throughout the book. It is a gentle drumbeat in the back of many of her stories. And there's a shorter story, which may become my favorite civic text of all time. It is a short section called Citizenship in Maple Nation. And she is envisioning, what if local government were not our city council? What if our local government were the trees to whom we are accountable and who are leading us? And it is lovely. It's a little bit funny. It's a little bit earnest. And in it, she says, I don't think the trees would talk about a Bill of Rights. I think the trees would talk about a Bill of Responsibilities. How do we care for the trees? And acknowledging how the trees care for us, because we understand that reciprocity is necessary to our mutual survival and thriving. And so when you talked about that shift from rights to responsibilities, it made me think of Maple Nation.
I mean, there's something deep to that.
Oof.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know that usually what we do now is the glossary of terms, and I'm going to admit I don't have anything from the glossary of terms.
Yeah, even though this chapter kind of did pick up on some phrases that are, in the mainstream culture that they define in some specific ways. So white allyship, white saviors, both of those they define in the book. But I don't we can pick up the definitions from the book if you want, but honestly, I found
No, you just reminded me of a question I have for you. Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm ready.
You're ready. So when we first started this, I had said, I was speaking about something and I had said something about myself as an ally. And you had some great pushback on that, that I still kind of think about, about what is, and, I see the other side of the coin, why people get frustrated about it's just, ally is ally. Why is it so problematic now? Why do you want us to use this other thing now? And I have some suppositions about what happens to words when they get co-opted in unhelpful ways. That's why the narrative changes. But would you feel comfortable kind of like talking a little bit more about allyship and why it can be toxic to use that as a concept?
Yes, with the disclaimer that I do not promise to be consistent with my earlier self because I don't remember what I said.
I think that every time that we have talked about this, because we've talked about it more than once, because I have misused that term more than once. And I always kind of learn a different little nuance every time that we discuss it, because it is so much a part of your community conversations. So yeah, I would love to hear whatever it is that you feel about it today.
There are a couple of things that come up for me right now. One is that claiming that you're an ally, in my experience, actually conveys no information. You haven't told me who you're in relationship with. You haven't told me the work that you have done and are doing. You haven't told me what your goals are. You have given yourself a title and shared it with me. And because we don't share definitions, no information has been communicated. So that's the first thing, is that the title is meaningless. And because it is meaningless, it is harmful. I'm kind of want to equivocate on that, but I'm not going to. That term is harmful because it is so easy to claim it as a way you are instead of things you have done and are doing, that it becomes more about, I want to signal to you that I see myself in this way, and I am absolving myself of the responsibility to share with you how I see ourselves in reciprocity and how I am participating in that, how I see my responsibilities to you and to, whatever I am claiming allyship to. It is a term that I have wariness around intellectually, but also from my experience, time after time after time. And I'll specifically claim white folks. I run in a lot of like political and policy circles, white folks in political circles who call themselves an ally. 100% of the time, in my experience, are not showing up the way that they think they are.
Because they haven't done the work to really unpack what it means to come alongside somebody.
Right. They have read many articles. They have read The Case for Reparations. They've read White Fragility. They've read studies, right? Like they've book clubbed whiteness and blackness and race, but they have not done meaningful internal work to identify their relationship to systems of oppression, extricating themselves from those systems and then smashing them. And without that work, the ally flag to me is meaningless and harmful.
I have a couple questions on that.
Yes.
So let's say, we're in a college town. We're all college flavored people, university flavored people, I guess I should say. I recognize in myself, I will do the homework.
Yeah.
But I will not do the work, which is different, right? When you're dealing with the humans versus the texts, right? The texts I recognize in myself, I use that learning as another way to distance me from my fellow humans.
And I don't think you're alone in that. I think a lot of people, especially as you say, university flavored people, but not unique to college towns, use intellectualization to substitute for relationships. And you're familiar with this in your philanthropy work, right? Like we do the homework, but man, making that ask or establishing a meaningful relationship in which you decide whether or not it makes sense to make that ask or not, that is hard, messy work. And it's easier to just not.
So can you boil it down for like somebody like me who's new into this work and I aspire to be an ally? I recognize that's harmful. I've done all my homework, and now you're telling me I need to do something else that I don't understand. Can you give me just one example of what that thing is that's not the book learning distancing.
Find actual Black people in your life and listen, and don't make it have to be about race. Just
Mm-hmm.
listen. Listen
Mm-hmm.
about their kids, listen about the home that they're trying to buy and or clean, listen about their work. Like, be real friends. Like, don't just show up and hope that racial learning happens one day. Be in relationship, because that is going to help you understand a life that's different from yours in ways that neither of you necessarily know how to or may need to articulate explicitly, but you can see differences. You know, a Black life, a Black community looks this way. My white life, my white community looks this way. It's not, you know, totally separate rooms. There's, of course, overlap. And I also want to make sure I'm not erasing biracial folks in this mix. Absolutely, you know, firm identities and camps, feet in both camps and neither, which is really tough. So what I'm saying is making sure that you are paying attention to the folks that are actually in your life, because then you're not showing up for a cause, you're showing up for a human that you like and maybe love.
So the downside of that
Mm-hmm.
is I'm going to go scoop up some Black people and
Right.
they're going to be my friends. And
That's
if
right.
anybody says that I'm racist, then
Mm-hmm.
I'm, you know, blah, blah, blah.
I have Black people. Mm-hmm.
So I know what I've done
Mm-hmm.
is I make sure to lower the density of white people in my life.
Mm-hmm.
That I go to a different coffee shop.
Mm-hmm.
I drink at a different bar.
Mm-hmm.
It may be uncomfortable for
Mm-hmm.
me to be a minority when I walk into those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the gig, you
Mm-hmm.
know, to meet people where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And I also I want to I can't remember if you say this or not, but I want to cabbage onto something that you said before I forget, which is, you know, you can't run out, make a whole bunch of Black and brown friends and then use them as reasons or permission slips to say and do the things that you say and do. That's not what this is about. You have the relationships, and then don't use the relationships, right? Like, don't use your
they're
relationships
not the
ever.
sounding board to make me feel okay about,
Mm-mm,
I said this thing in a
mm-mm.
room of Black and brown people and they got mad at me.
That's
What do
right.
you think about it? Like,
That's right.
that's
That's
not the
right.
role.
Mm-hmm. Yep, for sure. I just want to note that our very beloved friend and colleague, Brenda Williams,
Hi,
has
Bearhenda,
popped in.
beautiful
Hello,
human.
love. I hope you're having a good day, and you're welcome. So yeah, it's not about using relationships. It's about understanding who you're in relationship with, and that understanding cannot only come from books. Books are helpful, right? Like, that's why we're here, is we read a
Mhm.
book. Um,
But you have to apply in the
yeah,
real world.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, so, so when I get into weird conversations with other white women
Mm-hmm.
about like, but I don't know anybody,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
usually what my advice is go to a
Mm-hmm.
different coffee shop. Like, where do you spend your time?
I appreciate that. Usually, my advice is, and this is, you know, when I'm talking to folks who are in professions, find your professional association, and there will be a Black caucus, or there will be, for example, in architecture, there's NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architecture, which is its own organization outside of the AIA, the, you know, overall professional organization. Listen to your colleagues, partly because they're very well connected with each other. They probably have a pipeline program going. They understand what materials they need, or are working to understand what materials they need to be successful within their profession, which is also your profession. And so, if you're listening to your colleagues in a thoughtful way, that's going to bring you into like better, fuller relationships with the folks that you're working with. That's
Mm-hmm.
another way to listen.
Mm-hmm. And I think the nuances as well is that it is not appropriate for me to be in every room.
Yes. Right.
That
Well,
there
right.
are conversations that it is not
Mhm,
appropriate for me to be in this conversation.
mhm,
And what I do, if I'm ever, like, for example, that, you know, I'm now in this cohort with the Businesses of Color nonprofit,
mhm,
I asked several times, am I taking a spot from somebody else? Is it really, and in a way that it wasn't like in front of a room, like I went to the person who was managing it, and I just want to make sure that I'm good to go. And that was just me being transparent. You know, I still am not 100% sure if I'm doing the right thing, but I felt like I did some due diligence.
So here's another. I like that we're giving examples of how to exhibit solidarity without saying you're an ally. A tool that a friend and colleague of mine taught me a couple of years ago that has come in handy every single time is that when I am invited to speak to a group, I always ask about the demographics of the group, and I have started to ask, most recently, the last couple of years, who else has been invited to speak? Am I on a panel? Am I in a room with anybody else? If I'm on a panel, who else is on the panel? And I ask them to be specific. If I haven't been, I ask if I can bring somebody along, because I am never the only expert, the only person talking and thinking about, whatever the convened talk is or for the convened audience. And those speaking opportunities are really valuable professional development opportunities. They can be valuable to put on a CV, something like that. And so if I am bringing my Black and brown friends into rooms where I am being invited and either they are not, or the organizers don't even know that those folks are working in this space, I am expanding everyone's awareness, right? So my colleagues now know where talks are happening, where speaking opportunities are happening. And I'm also I make sure to ask about the pay for the speaking because I want to make sure that that's being equitably distributed as well. So that's not something that I say to the people, like when I'm giving a talk. Hi, Meg. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yep. It is an every moment work and an every moment choice. Man, that's a really good way to put it. That again, that's not something that I'll say necessarily to the room that I'm speaking to, but that is solidarity work that I do with the organizers. I remember a couple of years ago in the pandemic, I was invited by 2 young women of color to speak to an emerging professionals group. And I was excited to talk to them. This is an extremely diverse group. I was like, oh, yay, this is amazing. And it was an all-day event, really organized to help support this group's professional development. And I asked about the other speakers, and they were all white, in part because the young women didn't know who to reach out to. And the visible people that they knew were white, well-connected, fairly well-established folks. And so I asked if it was okay if we could invite some other folks in and maybe turn single talks into panels. They were down for it. They were totally down for it. And in the process, met some mentors, along the way, folks who look like them, who have walked similar paths, or who have gone to similar paths, who are much more able to kind of counsel them in their professional development than I am. So this chapter was long on criticism and short on recommendation, but a recommendation that I would have would be to switch from ally to solidarity, and don't take it as a title, take it as an action. Whew, that's on my spirit like all the time. And so when you asked the question, I was like, let's go.
Well, and I find it very difficult, right? That I want to understand what is the there, right?
Yes.
And recognize that I have a lifetime of swimming in the white water. And I don't know always where my first step into a wider beloved community is and where it's appropriate. Like, because you hear the other side of the criticism, right? Of white people feeling like everything, all the words are my words, all the rooms are my rooms. Why shouldn't I be? There's safe spaces and conversations that are not mine.
Correct.
And I think it's asking those questions, being transparent about why you're asking those questions, that you want to be a co-conspirator, but you also don't want to be appropriating a spot that is not yours. So thank you for that explanation. I think a lot of times I hear the concept, but I don't know what would be the one step I could do. And I think you've
illustrated
several steps that we could do. So
I mean,
no,
I
I appreciate
love your
that.
example of a coffee shop, and for me, finding restaurants that are owned by people of color. I mean, A, the food is probably going to be delicious, and B, you're going to be around folks and financially supporting folks, right? Like when we talk about, you and I haven't done a whole lot of talking in this series about the seeding of power, but that
We
happens.
talk about it a lot in person, though.
Yes, we do. Yes, maybe that'll be the next series. White folks ceding power. That'd be a
Right.
terrible sitcom, but a great conversation.
Yes.
A lot of that happens through your financial support, right? Like, who are you showing up financially for? And one of the reasons that, in that talk a couple of years ago that I mentioned, the firms that those women work in are likely to get more business, more referred business between the firms that all of them work for, which raises all of those boats, right? So that's really important.
Well, time and time again, we see all the, and this is me going to be a little bit of a nerd. Every bit of data that comes out about diversifying employees, work practices, all of that stuff, like you make more money. You have better retention. You do, like all the things, if you want to be a good capitalist, it just makes sense, from the data perspective.
And let me bring it back to, there's a quote in the book that I pulled out because I thought this is a part of why I'm here. The quote starts, "Until and unless you see your life in this fight, you will continue to see your work as help. You will continue to be a white savior. And white saviors are white supremacists in action." Part of the reason I'm in this work is because I understand the world better when I understand the people around me better. And understanding doesn't come through offering help, through giving charity. There's another quote in the book that says, "Help." This might be my favorite quote from the book, and I can say that now that we finished it. "Help is a poor substitute for liberation."
Yeah.
You guys, I have goosebumps just saying it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about setting the folks around me free. It's about setting me free too, because the emerging professionals group that I talked about, architects and urban planners, those are folks that are going to go on to design spaces and places that are deeply welcoming to an ever wider spectrum, wider spectrum of people, in ways that traditionally white driven architects and urban planning firms wouldn't be able to accommodate. And I want to occupy those spaces. So that's my liberation too.
Yes.
I feel like I'm preaching a little bit today, but
no, I'm all for
really,
it. We're getting to the end of the book, and I think you and I are kind of summing up some of the, it's almost like a trampoline effect, right? That this book is giving us some bounce for ideas, and further, looking over kind of our limitations out into the broader world that, yeah, I mean, so they did talk a little bit about philanthropy in here. And I think just to echo what you said about being a wider person and a deeper person, because there is the full spectrum of humanity engaged in your community. One of the challenges that I have with doing decentering whiteness, anti-racist approaches to fundraising and sharing wealth is sometimes you have to say no to money. Sometimes you have to say no to an opportunity. Sometimes you have to say no to whatever, because it doesn't fit with your emerging, evolving value sets, right? I am learning to be anti-racist. I am becoming more anti-racist as an organization, all the individuals within that organization. And there's a lot of really well-meaning white people working in nonprofit, particularly white ladies who are taking too little money and then screwing it up for everybody else because they have resources to do good work in the world. But that saying no creates space. And that space then has an opportunity to fill up with things that are more aligned with your values. And that's what I hold on to, but that it's like standing on the edge of a cliff sometimes, right? Sometimes you just have to understand, even if you've been presented with all the data that tells you your life will be better, richer, deeper, more community, whatever, healthier, if we have the full spectrum of humanity working on equal footing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if equal footing is the right way to put it. Equitable footing, perhaps. Even though you have all of that knowledge, right? You still can't jump off the cliff. I see Meg Collier makes a comment about resources are way more than money, and sacrifice should be scary. If it wasn't scary or uncomfortable, it wouldn't matter.
Meg, I really appreciate that point, and I want to bring up a specific anecdote. So, Patricia, you often say what we're defined by what we say no to, and it's one of my favorite of your sayings. But I also often come back to I should come up with a pithy saying for this, but we have to redefine what we're looking for. So, because otherwise, if we always do what we've always done, we're going to get what we've always gotten.
That's a very AA approach to this.
Yes.
What is the drug? The drug is racism.
That's right.
The anti-drug.
Right. For white folks, the drug is whiteness. Yeah, for sure. And white supremacy. So, for example, I was hiring for a position a few years ago. I was in an architecture nonprofit at the time. We were running architecture tours. And typically when organizations like that, and I'm connected with our peer organizations around the country, typically when they hire and you put out, whether it's a job posting if you're paying for it, or just a volunteer posting if you're not, if you put out a volunteer posting, you are self-selecting who is able, right, to be able to contribute to something like that. And B, if you just put it out, like you say, I'm an architecture nonprofit, I'm looking for somebody to lead architecture tours, who you're going to get is architects and realtors and retired people. That's who you're going to get. So I thought about the fact that, I was going to hire who I was going to hire, but I at least wanted the applicant pool to be diverse. And so instead of talking specifically about the nonprofit, although of course I disclosed what it was, what I asked for were experienced storytellers, because that meant that I was going to get folks who were a little bit further along in their career. And it meant that I could teach them the nuts and bolts of the story. But if they already know what it takes to hook folks in, to gear up their curiosity, to bring them along, to keep them interested and on their feet for 90 minutes, which is no small feat, then that was the person that I wanted. And I got to say, retooling that description was one of the most eye-opening and pleasurable experiences of my life, because interviewing storytellers for a storytelling job, oh my God, where part of the job interview was to tell a story. I mean, come on, I want that to be my job. So when you talk, Meg, about resources being way more than money, it's job opportunities, it's social capital, right? Like who you're introducing people to, like I talked about with the emerging leaders group. It's academic opportunities for your kids and the kids in your community. If it's not scary or uncomfortable, it wouldn't matter. That's 100% true. It's 100% true. And I really appreciate you saying that. I was pretty sure I was going to come back to a different point, but I forgot. Let me come back to my notes, actually, because there was something that I wanted to speak to on this.
Take a moment and look at your notes. Do you want to put our banner back up?
I thought I was putting our banner up.
There you go.
Technology. Okay. So I find these conversations most useful and uncomfortable and confusing when I bring them home for myself. So I read let me go back to White Allies, White Saviors, White Violence. And I brought it home to my political work. And I run in nonprofit circles in many various ways. But in this instance, I'm going to identify with politics. I live in Ann Arbor. And if you know Ann Arbor, you know that I just told you that I identify as a progressive liberal Democrat. And there are a lot of ways that folks here demonstrate allyship. And I say that in the way that I mean it, in the way that they mean it, which is I show that I'm a good white person. And a lot of it is to know the statistics of harm in our community, of racialized harm in our community, to look at the research of what academics are saying will solve that harm, and then advocate for the research, or the policy based fixes that are based on the research, almost none of which happens in conversation with the aforementioned actual Black people, their lived experience in this community, and what they would like to see happen in their community, right? I'm not saying research doesn't matter, but I'm saying if that's all you're advocating for and it's devoid of relationships, of meaningful relationships, I'm not sure you're doing the work that you think you're doing. And,
It's
yeah.
an aspect, it's a tool. And I really agree with that I will bring it back to the philanthropic side,
Mm-hmm.
that I'm a socialized data wonk, so I love a good data set. And I spent many years in data analytics in nonprofit, as well as frontline fundraising. Data is just a data point. There's a story. You can knit the data point together in all sorts of ways, but the story is not necessarily whatever the interpretation is that you make straight out of the gate. And I believe in that as far as like research with donors and stuff too. Like I am not one of those people who over prepares for a donor visit, because rarely in the history of the relationship with a donor did anybody ask them, why do you do the things that you do? What are your values? What do you want to accomplish in the world? And being in conversation with the work that you're doing, the work of your nonprofit, as well as the money that you're gathering, I just don't see any other way. Like, the data will tell you a trend, but it may not mean what you think it means.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a hard transition for me to make,
Mm-hmm.
towards using it as a piece of the information, but not all the information, because there was some lived experience that I was separating myself from by saying,
Right.
this is
Mm-hmm.
what the trend is.
Mm-hmm.
So I really hear that,
Mm-hmm.
that how many times did, we do something, particularly when I was in higher education fundraising, that actually the school didn't want, or the people who were working for it didn't actually want.
Right.
But the money was driving the conversation, or the data was driving the conversation, rather than having a conversation with the community, the recipients, the whoever was the purpose of our mission.
And I will say that I have done this and I still struggle against doing it. Like the criticism that I made just now, first of all, speaking of bumping noses, I just said an uncomfortable thing to my colleagues. And I hope that that's, speaking to, folks that I work with that are on the onlines, I hope this is something that we can have a conversation about. This is still something that I am working to contend with, because I feel so convinced by my opinions and by my stacks of books, and the things that they tell me, the anecdata and the anecdotal, both. There's one project that's still underway, so unfortunately I can't talk about the specifics, but I came into it because of advocacy that I was doing and was invited into a formal role, basically serving as a liaison between an entirely Black community group and folks who were working on a particular kind of project. And my role was to sort of translate between the two, right? Translate power to Black folks and Black folks to power. And that has been an incredibly humbling experience, just incredibly humbling, where I am learning new things about listening carefully, that I thought I knew, and didn't totally, because again, of the conviction of my beliefs. It's not that my beliefs aren't different now. How I work on them is. How I promote what I think is important is very different than it was this time a year ago. And I don't know how I would have done that except to come alongside, a large group of Black folks who are deeply engaged in the issue at hand, where my role was to listen and translate. I got it wrong a few times, especially at the beginning of the year. Um, because I was translating towards the outcome that I wanted.
Rather than the outcome that was needed.
It wasn't the outcome that was being discussed. It was harm that needed reckoning with.
Okay.
And they said, this harmed us. And I said, this harmed them, therefore we should do this thing. Which was not what was called for. Like, white savior, right here. Recovering white savior. And I can't even say the number of days that it's been since my last slip up, but it's less than 365. And it's because of the work that I do, right? Like, my work is helping work. But it means my work has to be more meaningfully listening work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What a lot of ground we're covering.
I'm just going to breathe into that for a second. I wanted to come back to something that I said earlier about being careful in a room where I was the one white person in a room of Black and brown women. I ended up having a conversation with the woman who was sitting next to me about faith and whiteness and being called to something that I thought was really tender and transparent. Because what I said to her too was, she wanted to know why I was in this room. And by naming it about I'm a white woman and saying that and not assuming that she would immediately understand how I'm triangulating myself, if that makes sense, like naming my whiteness, was an interesting place to start as far as like transparency and vulnerability. And I think about the work that you do in all these spaces about being vulnerable and walking that line of leadership and listening and expertise and learning. That's our no right to comfort right there.
Yep.
Those are all the thoughts I have on that.
I wonder, I feel like we have sailed beautifully through kind of the content of the chapter as it relates to the work that we do. I wonder if we could offer each other a closing thought, and I have that invitation without having anything in mind. And this for the folks following along on the onlines too. If you have a thought that's kind of come up for you as a result of this conversation, I'd love to know.
Or an action that you're going to take.
Love that.
One small, tiny thing. I'm considering. And I'm opening the floor to Jess first so that I can keep thinking.
All right. When I read the book, actually when I read any book, I always capture the quotes kind of land on me in the moment. And so I'll come back to my last quote that I captured from this chapter, which is, we can't approach this work with our typical white arrogance. The I know how to do this and you need to follow along way. That is my work right now. Like you said, that iterating between expertise and learning, between listening and leadership, that is 100% my work right now, because I do have experience and I do have some expertise. And the point is to put them in service of community, not use it as a means to badger people to do the thing I think we need to do. And so putting my expertise in service is my active learning edge right now.
Thank you for that. I'm going to quote Jess to Jess.
Right on.
As the closing. Well, or what Jess sent me earlier today, which is another wonderful quote. And Jess, if you know the proper pronunciation of this person's name, will you
Paulo
correct me?
Coelho.
Paulo Coelho.
Mm-hmm.
The reward of our work is not what we receive, but in who we become. And it's the process. It's not the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
I have on my little desk a yellow Post-it note that says, I choose to align myself with love of the work and not attachment to the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And this is loving work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's my end.
I appreciate you.
I appreciate you.
I appreciate our online friends. Thanks for coming along for the conversation. We will see you for one more conversation when Patricia and I debrief the book. And we have not prepped that yet, but I gotta say, I'm looking forward to that one.
Peace.